The best is yet to come. Your best is inside of you. Your best is yet to come. Your best is inside of you.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of The Best Is Yet to Come. I am your girl Steph, and as always we have another awesome show lined up for you tonight. As you know, our last few episodes we've been talking about having guests on to help us bring more awareness to what's plaguing our community, which is substance usage and the addictions and all the need that's out there. And one of the things that each guest had in common, they talked about not only trying to give back, being part of the solution, they talked about in their story some form of trauma. Tonight, our guest is no different. She is a certified trauma coach. In addition to that, she is also a registered harm reductionist nurse in Brockton. I had the opportunity to talk with her this morning, and when I tell you, I felt as if I've known her longer than this morning, okay? A lot of stuff that she talked about really resonated with my spirit, in my spirit, and also have been in line what the show is about and what we've been trying to do. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Miss Alba Soto. Welcome to The Best Is Yet to Come.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you guys. My passion is definitely to be able to give back to the community, to be a representative of the individuals that are out there and have that lived experience of what it's like to struggle with mental health, with trauma, and also understand how to overcome that, both from the perspective of trauma liberation, but also from the perspective of really understanding why substance use happens, as well as how we can address the need for healing and ultimately be able to overcome and really remove the silence, remove the veil, and remove the shame so that ultimately we can be able to make that change in our culture, in our society, and in our community.
Yes. You know, I like that you say, remove the veil, remove the silence. That's something that we talked about with my last week guest. The taboo, how in our culture we are taught that whatever goes in the home, goes on in the home, stays in the home. And, it's silence people that are being victimized, and you later in life see it come out in ways that we are seeing today. You being a trauma coach, what made you decide to go that avenue of being a trauma coach?
So I have a lived experience of being a survivor of family sexual trauma. So I had abusers within my own home, and that caused me to live in silence or to live a lie for a very long time, that I couldn't actually speak up about what had happened to me. And as time went on, that lived experience with that trauma, what it ultimately did is it enabled me to get into other toxic relationships that had the same similar familiarity and pattern of toxicity and pattern of feeling disempowered, feeling voiceless, feeling like I couldn't speak up for myself. So these circumstances that I dealt with under the age of 5 ultimately led to other toxic relationships in my adulthood. And there came a time where I said enough is enough. I need to embark on this healing journey. It wasn't because I felt like it was enough for me. I looked at my children and I said, they deserve better. I want to break the cycle so that they're not experiencing the effects of my trauma, so that I'm not bleeding onto them, so that I'm not continuing to keep this cycle going of trauma.
Right.
So it wasn't until I became a mother and my daughter was the same age of my abuse that I was ultimately able to say, you know what, I got to do something about this.
Absolutely.
And ultimately beginning to embark on my healing journey and then ultimately speak my truth is what allowed me to really just overcome and continue to find tools and tricks and tips along the way that now I feel like it would be unfair to me to hold on to these things by myself. Like, I have to share this with the world so that other people can have this sense of liberation. And that's how ultimately I became a trauma liberation coach.
Great. Now, I listened to one of your interviews that you had did with someone. I mean, you have such great, and I hope we are able to bring these up, little sayings, quotes that you came up with yourself. For an example, you talked about the tools. Can you share with our audience what you say, without the tools?
Without tools, trauma rules.
I like that, yes.
So it's like, if I go through life and just allow life to happen to me, I'm going to continue to allow my inner child to take the driver's seat and cause a wreck of a situation. So we all have an inner child that is in the car with us, which is the embodiment of our lived experiences and our emotions that we experienced as a child that we didn't have the capacity to conceptualize and to deal with and to really process those emotions. So the personification of those emotions is our inner child. So our inner child is in the car with us at all times. And I don't know if anyone knows a toddler, but a toddler in the back seat that's over here wanting attention, like mommy, 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 mommy. If you ignore that inner child is going to get louder and ultimately kick the back of the seat and ultimately take over and get in that driver's seat. And if you think about the idea of a toddler or a child driving, they lack the sense of perception. They can't see beyond the wheel. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the concept of speed and brake and all of this stuff. So what ends up happening is they end up taking over your life and affecting your relationships, affecting your family dynamic, affecting how you react at work, affecting all these different situations. And you find yourself in these wreck of a situations and you're like, how did I get so emotionally involved and invested in this situation? And now I don't even know how to get myself out of it. It's like, oh, because your inner child decided to take the keys and go for a stroll. And now here you are dealing with the consequences. Because once it's all said and done, the inner child goes back to the seat like, I didn't do anything. Meanwhile, they got like powder all over their face and they, they got all of the signs that they were up to no good. But needless to say, we're in a situation where if we don't have the sense of awareness that our inner child exists and that our inner child requires a certain level of attention, because all you have to say is, oh, that's beautiful. I see it. I see you, right? As long as I can give you that level of affirmation and recognition, you now can go back to being an adult. I got the keys and I'm in control of the situation, as opposed to allowing life to just happen to you. So that's just one of the tools that I have in my tool belt to say, like, have this sense of awareness that my inner child is a part of me. I need to be able to assess, what does my inner child need? And when is it time for me to say, you know what, it's time for you to have a seat. Because I need to be in charge here. This is the time where I need to be present. And I need to be able to make sure that the decisions that I'm making, that I'm gonna deal with the consequences, because I know what is required. So I can show up as my adult self, because ultimately it's a trigger. And I understand at this stage of my healing that triggers, there's nothing wrong with being triggered. Triggering is just giving you the awareness that there's something in there that wants to be healed, that wants to be processed, So
that.
if I lean into that, if I lean into the trigger, lean into the discomfort, on the other side, I'm going to feel so much better.
Right.
As opposed to going through life avoiding these triggering situations. Because everything is a learning experience. It's a learning opportunity.
Now, you talked about your tool belt. What are some other tools that you have in your belt that you could share with the audience?
Oh, so I am many things. So I'm a mother, and I do find that mothering has been one of the amazing things that has happened to me because it allowed me to reconnect with my inner child outside of my body.
Okay.
Right? So, especially mothering a daughter, I didn't realize how challenging it would be for me to mother a daughter, especially one who hasn't experienced the trauma that I experienced and is so bold, is so confident, it's so outspoken. It's almost intimidating to me. Like, how dare you be so
Right.
strong and confident and like and it sounds strange because it almost makes me sound like I'm a bad mom, but it's almost like I didn't have that.
Right.
I didn't understand what that meant
Right.
at your age.
Right.
So
How
I
old
don't
is
even
she?
have,
Sorry.
she's 10.
Okay.
So I don't have that reference point to understand that this is a normal thing for a child who hasn't experienced a level of trauma that I experienced, right? So mothering is one of the things that has helped me heal from like from an external perspective.
Okay.
I do a lot of writing. So I'm an author. I wrote a book called, and this was a book that I co-authored, called Fire Starters, Being the Spark of Hope in the Midst of Change. And I wrote it around COVID.
Okay.
And it was an opportunity for me to be able to share with the world that you don't have to identify with the problem that you experience, that you can use that to inspire others and be the change that you want to see in the world, was ultimately the message in my chapter. So definitely writing has been super powerful. And more than anything, it has been just to really just do what I'm doing right now, speak my truth.
Okay.
Because it empowers others to do the same thing.
Right. Now, could you, before we forget, could you please share with the audience where they can get your book from?
So you can go on my website, albasototlc.com, and on there you can click on the link to go get my book called Fire Starters.
Great. Something that you just mentioned while you was talking about the purpose of your chapter, and I strongly feel that you can't share or help heal someone unless you have gone through a particular situation. What is your thoughts on that?
Interesting. So that's an interesting opinion that I too had, right? Because I felt like at the moment that I was looking for a therapist for the first time, after years and years and years of like, I'm going to do it on my own. I'm just going to sweep this under the rug and sweep this under the rug and sweep this under the rug until there's too much stuff under this rug. I keep tripping on it.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, I got to do something about this, right? So I thought that I needed to have someone that looked like me, that experienced life the same way I experienced, and that had certain cultural similarities in order to be able to help me with my healing. Because it's like, what do you know about life? Because clearly, like, I've lived enough trauma for like 10 people in one. I don't think you can relate. So there was like this sense of like what I would consider a trauma Olympics. So I would always want to like be like, oh, well, you know, is your trauma as bad as my trauma? Because I've lived a few. So let's compare, right? And ultimately that was my pain body speaking, seeking validation from someone else's painful experience to kind of develop what I would consider, or what has been considered to be a trauma bond, right? So it's trying to develop that trauma bond. So I want to have somebody who can relate to me, that has similar pains. Therefore, we can have this trauma bond, and then we can just go on through life with this very toxic type of relationship of sorts, right? And that is definitely a symptom of the trauma or a side effect of the trauma, like seeking to get that validation from somebody else's suffering that's similar to yours. But it's not necessarily a requirement to be able to help somebody. I find that because of my lived experience and because I'm so transparent with my lived experience, it enables other people to feel heard and to open up to me. So whereas somebody else could be like, I don't talk to nobody, I don't tell nobody my business, they'll come to me and in 5 minutes they're telling me everything, you know. So in that way I feel like God has gifted me with this amazing ability to communicate and articulate my suffering in a way that allows people to feel that sense of connection and also to open up. So in that way, I find it beneficial for me, but that doesn't mean that that's the way somebody else needs healing, or that's the way somebody else relates, right? Because it's very important to understand that we don't want to focus on the trauma bond itself, and it's not a trauma Olympics because one person was molested and another person was raped. It doesn't devalue or devalidate the experience of the person that was molested. It doesn't make their situation any less significant. If a person had an attempt of an assault, whereas another person was actually physically assaulted, it doesn't make one experience less than the other.
Absolutely.
So that's where I feel like that's where the bias comes in, and that's where we have certain perceptions going in, like, I need this in order to feel validated. It's like, why do I need that? Oh, that's my trauma talking. Let me see if I can reel that back in. And truly be open to having these healing opportunities without the bias.
Well, another thing that you just said, I too am a mother. I have 4 children. My youngest is 18. The oldest one is 33. And one thing that I always taught them, that you can't discount someone else's perception, because our perception is our reality. So you may feel different, or I may feel different, but I can't discount, what you feel or what you say, because that's, what you feel. So it's like what you just said about someone being almost assaulted and someone being assaulted. It's still trauma. So you're right there. To me, it's no level to, well, it shouldn't be no level to trauma. Can you share a little more about your story and, where you started and, how did you end up here?
Awesome. So for me, my trauma started around the age of 3 or 4 years old, where I began to be sexually abused by an uncle and a few cousins in the family as well. And that was when I lived in Dominican Republic. When I was 5, I moved to Brockton. And during that move to Brockton, because my dad was already in America, so I was being raised by my mom, and then also with the support of my dad's family, which were my aunts in DR. And when I met my dad for the first time, because he wasn't there at my birth, and he got there like when I was older, I saw him as my savior. Because he was the one that was going to take me out of the life that I was living. And when I came to America, it was like snowing white in January. So I was kind of like in a state of shock of like, oh, wow, this is freezing. This is different, right? But also it was this sense of newness. Like I can now rediscover who I am in this new world, in this new place. And that's when I was determined to be a good girl, right? Because prior to that, I was a bad girl, because I felt that sense of guilt and that felt that sense of shame, but it's like, this is a blank slate. This is an opportunity for me to be a good girl.
Before you go further, let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people will own things that they shouldn't own. How do we help people to heal from that? You know, like you said, now you have this opportunity to be a good girl, but you were a good girl. Something was done bad and wrong to you. And a lot of people, when they have gone through trauma, we own what was done to us. How do we navigate and heal from that?
So to embody the shame and the guilt that comes with experiencing trauma, it's entirely too common. It's entirely too common for the reasons that it's like, for example, for me, I was a toddler, right? Toddlers are very egocentric. The world revolves around me. Like, it must be my fault because I'm the center of my universe. How amazing is it to be the center of your universe? Yes. You know, and it makes sense that at the age of 3 or 4, I would feel like what was done to me is my fault because I am the center of my universe, right? And it would also make sense that I wouldn't have the language capacity to articulate what I'm feeling, to be able to ask questions and to be able to understand what it was that I was feeling. So because at that age I couldn't articulate that, the only way it makes sense to me was that it's my fault. And from the moment where I came to the United States at age 5, and then ultimately when I was 9, which was my first memory of my sexual abuse, because I ultimately erased that.
Okay.
So what happens a lot of times with trauma is that we disassociate and we also forget. Our mind is an amazing, amazing part of our body that helps to delete certain things that are painful until we're able to process that at a later age. Or maybe we're not able to process it and it still comes to us like a flood and we're like, whoa, what is this, right? So when I was 9, I was introduced to my abuser, my uncle, and I had to hug and give him a kiss on the cheek because culturally that's what we do as Dominicans. And in that moment, my body remembered what had happened to me because now I'm 9, but I'm like, you know, I'm a new person, right? And my body froze, my body tensed. And my body remembered what had happened to me. And there's this book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is an amazing book that talks about how the trauma lives in our body. And the disassociation that we have, that we disconnect with our body, is a way of almost like coping with that pain and not dealing with it and numbing out from it. In that moment where I remembered what had happened to me, I instantly embodied that sense of shame and guilt. I didn't know why, but instantly my head went down. I was silent, and there was this change in my demeanor completely, and no one else seemed to notice. So sometimes it's important to understand that even though a child is not actually saying what happened to them, they're vocalizing that in other ways, whether that means that they're silent all of a sudden, whether that means that they're raging out, whether that means that all of a sudden they tense up, wetting the bed, things of that nature. So that night, when I had gone to sleep or tried to go to sleep, I began to have flashbacks because up until then I had no memory. I just couldn't understand why I felt so uncomfortable. So I couldn't sleep. And then when I went to sleep, I started to have flashbacks of my abuse. And it was like picture, 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 picture. And it wasn't clear what had happened because it wasn't like a video. It was just images, inappropriate images that involved me. Again, I'm the common denominator here. Like I must have done something to like deserve this or so on. And when I wake up from this nightmare of sorts, I feel this sense of shame and guilt, but I also felt these sensations of pleasure, and my body was reacting
Okay.
in a way that it only led me to believe that this must have been my fault, because why would I feel this way? Why is my body reacting in this way, right? So it's important to understand that people who experience sexual abuse will still have, normal bodily reactions at times. It's not always painful. It could be that their body reacts, they get wet, or they get, erect, or they experience or may not experience an orgasm. Like, these things happen because it's part of the body, the body's response, and it doesn't equate to it's your fault.
Right.
Or you asked for it.
Right. Or you're enjoying it.
Exactly.
Right.
So in those moments, I began to cope through different aspects of exploring pleasure, which only led me to feel more guilty and think like, of course it's your fault. You asked for it. So it makes sense why somebody would do that. But what it does ultimately, it holds you in bondage.
Okay.
Because you feel like, as a person who's guilty, you deserve to go to jail, you deserve to be sentenced, and therefore you have to live with that pain. You have to live with yourself, right? And the sentencing doesn't necessarily end, because you don't tell yourself you're going to sentence yourself to 3 years in guilt prison.
Right.
It could potentially be the rest of your life, because it's up until you decide enough is enough. Let me speak my truth. Let me be liberated from this shame. Let me, name the elephant in the room, that when we go to Thanksgiving dinner,
Right.
I have to sit here and look at this person and I feel uncomfortable. I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe having my child here, or so on. Like, once you're able to say these things, it ultimately begins to unlock those shackles. And then you can kind of realize that, oh, it wasn't my fault. This was done to me, and I didn't ask for this.
Right.
Which is one part. But there's also other reasons that people feel even more compound guilt on top of it.
And what do you think some of these reasons are?
So, for example, oftentimes one of the common symptoms or side effects of trauma is that now your mind is opened to this new world of sorts, right? And you begin to explore, and you explore with other people, right? So whether that means you were abused at the age of 4, and now at the age of 7, you're now abusing somebody else at the age of 5 or 6, or even the same age, right? And then that person then gives it to someone else. And we know how Corona gets around. So it's almost like a virus that now gets passed down from one person to another. Could be siblings, could be cousins, could be neighbors, could be friends, could be same sex, could be opposite sex, could be anything. But it's like, because you were exposed to this virus of sorts, now you're going to pass it on to other people. And now you're having to live with yourself, with the fact that you did this to somebody else, as you're also trying to process what happened to you. So it makes you feel as if you don't have any right to speak up about what happened to you, because now somebody's looking at you as if you did the same thing. Not understanding that at the age that you were, you didn't have the ability to consent. Therefore, what happened after that was only a symptom of what happened to you.
Right. Absolutely.
And sometimes parents will walk in and we'll see 2 children doing something, and instantly what happens?
They're punished.
They're going to get a whooping.
Right. Right.
And that's the last thing you should do to somebody who's traumatized, because they won't ever tell you.
Right. Because they definitely are owning that now. I did something wrong. Mommy caught me doing it. She punished me for it. So I know it's my fault.
The same thing with masturbation. If you catch a child masturbating who has experienced sexual abuse and they get beat, hurt, spanked, whatever, that also leaves a mark on them that says, it's my fault.
Right, right. Now, at what point, and if you could share with the audience, did you say enough is enough? And what did that look like for you?
So I dealt with narcissistic abuse from the father of my first 2 children.
Okay.
And it wasn't until my children, and I found myself like crying on my children's shoulders. Like there was no one else around me but them, and they would be wiping off my tears and all of the things, right? That I had to recognize that they deserved better.
Okay.
And as a result of them deserving better, I needed to make that choice to walk away.
Okay.
It didn't mean that that was the end of toxic relationships for me. It didn't mean that that was the end of me being triggered or me, having my inner child, drive and mess up a few things in life. But what it meant is that was the beginning of me saying no.
Okay.
Like my first time being able to say no.
Okay.
And that was a difficult thing for me
Okay.
growing up, like being able to understand that it's okay to have boundaries.
Right.
It's okay to set limitations.
Right.
Because if you don't set limitations, that means that you're not safe.
Right.
Or that you're accepting or tolerating things that are causing you harm.
Right. Can we back up a little bit? Listening to your interview, you talked about, becoming a people pleaser and how you did extremely well in school. And almost like, I think you used the word, is that became a drug of choice. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about that some, please?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I have said before is that I'm a firm believer in that trauma is the gateway drug.
Yes.
And addiction saves more lives than it takes. And that's a difficult pill for people to swallow. And I almost have to repeat it every single time I say it because it doesn't make sense when you hear it the first time. So I'll repeat that. Trauma is the gateway drug, and addictions saves more lives than it takes.
Can I just share something? Hold that thought for a minute. I'm sorry for cutting you off. My oldest son, I like to bounce things off of him because he's such a deep thinker. So I was sharing with him, because he's really interested in the show and stuff. I was sharing with him about you being a guest on the show. And I said that to him, that, this is a phrase that you said to me. And I, too, had to ask you to repeat it. And when I said it to him, he said, yeah, that makes sense. Of course it is. So I was really surprised, when he just got it like, yeah, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
So when understanding the role that addiction plays in providing you with that short-term fix, whether that means that you're no longer feeling the pain, or whether that means that you're experiencing a certain level of numbing out, okay, or even pleasure, right? Because someone who experienced sexual trauma could become a person who's addicted to masturbation. Mm-hmm. It could be someone who's addicted to sex. It could be someone who's addicted to like being a battered woman or a victim of battered woman syndrome and things of that nature, as well as alcohol, opiates, or any other drug, mm-hmm, out there, right? And part of it is that you wouldn't necessarily tell me that if I tell you I have this migraine and this light is really bothering me and I'm reaching for my migraine medication, you wouldn't see anything wrong with that.
Right.
Because clearly you can see that I'm physically suffering.
Yes.
And if you see me coming in here limping because my knees are aching and they're cracking and all of that, and then you see me reaching for something for my pain, you're not going to say anything.
Right.
Because it makes sense. I have a pain and now I'm taking something to alleviate that pain.
Absolutely.
But what happens when I have a pain body, which is a result of my lived experience and my trauma, this compound trauma, mm-hmm, this complex PTSD that I'm carrying with me every day. And even though I'm wearing my mask and I'm smiling, mm-hmm, and I'm, happy, mm-hmm, to be here, deep down, I'm in pain, mm-hmm, and I'm suffering and I'm feeling hopeless. Mm-hmm. But when I go to reach that bottle to numb out, when I go to reach that dope to no longer feel this pain, right, all of a sudden there's a stigma to that, mm-hmm, right? There's a problem with that. But it's the same thing.
Right.
Because you're trying to cope with and deal with that pain and that suffering. And one of the things that I know to be true is that we do the best that we can with the resources that we have.
Yes.
And if I have someone in front of me who experiences that very heavy pain body where they no longer want to be here and they could choose suicide or the bottle, and they chose the bottle, they did the best they could with the resources that they had.
Right.
And that alcohol will allow them to live another day so that they can then in the future process and deal with that pain in a way that hopefully would lead to more healing as opposed to numbing out or avoiding, right? But they might not have the resources or the tools or the ability to ask for help in that moment. So in that moment, they did the best that they could. And that alcohol could have led to cocaine, could have led to crack, could have led to opiates such as heroin and fentanyl. But ultimately, it was as a result of trying to alleviate a pain that only they can see and feel and carry every day.
Right. You know, that's one of the things that I'm a firm believer in. Mental health and addiction is two things that don't discriminate. It does not discriminate. And I feel like we need to not only, well, bring an awareness to it is the beginning, but I feel like there is so much more that we have to do. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, it does not discriminate. And I do feel like there's definitely a lack of support, a lack of engagement, a lack of representation for individuals that look like you and I. And it doesn't mean that the resources aren't available. It doesn't mean that there isn't treatment that works. It doesn't mean that these treatments aren't accessible. It means that culturally and systemically, we have a difficult time getting out of that victim mentality, being able to ask for help, being able to break through the silence. Because oftentimes in our cultures, we'll say, what happens at home stays at home. You ain't going to tell nobody our business.
Right.
I'll be damned if you're going to... That's pillow talk.
Right.
You don't go tell nobody that. And as a matter of fact, you don't need to be telling anybody in the family either. Because then you're just going to make us look bad.
Right.
So, yeah. So a lot of what happens in terms of accessing the support, accessing the treatment, and ultimately being able to end the suffering and live a life of liberation from substances, live a life of liberation from mental health, is like we have to be willing to speak our truth. We have to be willing to understand that this trauma that gets passed down from one generation to another, to another, to another, to another. It's in our DNA. And even though I will do better than my parents did, and they will do better than their parents did, and they will do better than their parents did, their version of better, if they're not willing to heal and deal, it's not going to alleviate their children from being victims of the same repeated cycles. Because when I was first... when I first became a parent, I didn't understand what was a trauma response and what was my actual parenting. So when I am looking at my child who's 3 and 4 years old and hypersexualizing her and wanting to like cover her up and like, you know, shelter her, and like I'm anxious when I bring her somewhere around family, or when, you know, she starts like jumping on somebody and wanting to like be a normal kid, I'm just like, no, you do not sit on nobody's lap. You don't do this. You don't do that. You don't do this. And I was just so controlling, so hyper vigilant, and ridiculously anxious that I'm hurting my child by trying to protect them. And I had to understand that my experience was separate from my child's experience, and that I didn't have to project my fears and project my pain onto my child, which will ultimately repeat the same thing.
Right. Right.
By me trying to avoid it.
Right. Right.
I'm going to control the heck out of my child to the point where she's going to run away from home at age 13 because her mom was crazy.
Right. You know, it's funny when I listened to the interview, and I'm glad that you sent that, because it kind of prepared me, because it was like looking in the mirror. I have 2 daughters, okay, and I was that mom, you know? And you're absolutely right. It takes over what could be beautiful moments throughout a mother and a daughter, a mother and child's relationship.
The beautiful thing is that one of the biggest things that I feel like is the ultimate liberator is grace. Grace is liberating. That means that I can have grace with myself,
Yes.
and I can give you that grace as well,
Yes.
in a way that can allow us permission to make mistakes and grow and learn along the way. So I have had moments where I speak to my 11-year-old son, and I'm trying to teach him the lesson of the importance of honesty.
Okay.
Right? And I had to be honest with myself and with him and say, you know what? For a long time, I was living a lie. I was a liar. Because my trauma meant that I couldn't speak my truth. And as a result, I learned that living a lie would be rewarding.
Right.
And pleasing others, or wanting to tell others what they wanted to hear as opposed to what you actually felt, was the right way to do things. And it wasn't until I started messing up relationships as an adult that I realized that lying is detrimental.
Right.
So I had to sit there and have a conversation with him and say, you know what, I'm sorry, because I'm coming from a perspective of mom's a know-it-all, and I'm gonna school you, and I'm gonna tell you what you need to do, and you need to listen to me. But I have to humble myself and say, I too have made mistakes. And you know what? You probably won't learn just by me telling you that this is how you should do it.
Right.
You might have to have your own experiences that will allow you to recognize the importance of being honest.
Right.
And you might not learn that until you're an adult.
Right.
And I have to be okay with that. And I have to give you that grace. I have to give you that permission. And sometimes I'll be like, listen, don't come to me, go to God. Because only God can save you right now. Because right now, you over here doing the most. And I don't even know if I can contain myself. So go to God.
Right.
Go pray about it.
Right.
Repent.
Right. It's funny that you say that. One of my guests a couple of weeks ago, we was talking about, you know, children and stuff. And my oldest son has had his bumps in the road, as I like to call it. And I used to wonder, how is it that 3 children could be raised in the same household, and this one right here didn't get the memo or whatever, and just doing his own thing. But then like you talk about that grace, I feel like certain things that we go through help shape us who we were intended to be.
It's interesting because that saying, or that statement that you just said, reminds me of the black sheep of the family, right? There's always one that's a rebel, and just wants to kind of go to the beat of their own drum. And I can identify with that. And when I finally decided to step out of the people pleaser mode, I realized there's a lot of things that I just don't want to be a part of.
Okay.
Whether that means family events, whether that means, what everybody else likes to do, I just might want to do the opposite, right? And it's an opportunity for parents to be able to learn from their children and discover what it is that they were put on this earth to become and be, as opposed to feeling as if they're our personal projects and we're here to mold them into what we want them to be. So that's like one thing. And just to kind of bring the topic of addictions into it, because oftentimes the individuals that are the outcast or the black sheep or the rebels in the family, and it could be multiple in the family, especially considering if the family has a significant amount of trauma that they've lived through, and even addictions that has been passed down from one generation to another. That oftentimes these individuals feel a sense of shame and guilt that has them isolating, feeling separate from God, feeling separate from their family, because they won't be accepted as who they are. And because I feel like no one is going to accept me for who I am, whether that means a person that's struggling with addictions, whether that means a person that's going to do things a little different, that's going to be a little defiant, and things of that nature, that's ultimately what will create more of a divide in that relationship, create more isolation. And in that isolation is where all of these things can continue to brew in terms of not feeling worthy, not feeling deserving, feeling separate from God, not feeling like I deserve grace, not feeling accepted, and ultimately leads to more self-destructive behaviors. So I feel like one of the biggest things that we can do to alleviate some of that isolation and suffering is be a little bit more open to accepting individuals as they are, and also understanding that there's something that you were brought into this world and that you can teach me from your unique perspective, from your unique lived experience. Because I know individuals who have lived and struggled with abuse, and during that time that they were in the life, it wasn't all bad. They had some good moments. Like I have individuals that will express, like, during that time, I was able to save 6 lives. 6 lives that had overdosed and everybody else abandoned them, but I made the choice to stay there. And that to me is just like, wow, like God was using you in the midst of your chaos, in the midst of your darkest moments. You were able to be that light for somebody else, be that hope for somebody else. And that's the part that we won't ever know if we simply separate from that person, if we simply put on blinders and choose not to see that person as a valuable, decent human being. Because oftentimes these individuals, they're nurses, they're engineers, they're singers, they're parents, and it doesn't mean that they don't have a desire to be here. That's one of the things that it's like one of the biggest things that I learned. It's like, wow, you managed to stay alive for the past 10 years that you've been doing this. You must be doing something right.
You know, it's funny that you say that, because my guest last week was a lead singer, original lead singer for a group called the Platters, and a well-known group, for that era. And he traveled the world, been to countries that some people only can dream about. And that's the reason why I say, it definitely does not discriminate, and him sharing his story, it stemmed from things that happened to him as a child that were not addressed. And he took his first drink. He said he was an introvert. He took his first drink and it opened up. He was able to talk. And then from there, things just progressed. And it just goes back to what, we often talk about, the untreated trauma or mental health.
Exactly. Absolutely. Because what we don't address or confront or we avoid, it's still going to affect us in one way or another. And that's the thing, that for some people, they think healing is scary. Living life without healing is scary.
Scarier.
Yes.
Yes.
Like literally, you're
Yes.
out here not quite in control, thinking that you're in control with that false sense of control.
Right.
And not willing to surrender to a higher power, not willing to surrender to your purpose, not willing to surrender to the healing journey. And in that sense of, that false sense of control, you're in this chaos that feels very familiar. You're in this pattern that is repeating over and over again. And at some point you take a look at yourself and you're like, I'm the common denominator. I must be the problem.
Right.
And it's like, no, it's like, you don't have to be identified as your struggle. It's like, I know so many people who come in to see me in the office and they're like, I'm an alcoholic. It's like, no,
You're not.
you're not.
Right.
You are a person
Right.
that is struggling
Right.
with this substance.
Yes.
But you're a person first and
Right.
foremost.
Right.
And as a person, what do you desire? What is your purpose? What do you want for your life?
Right.
What excites you, right? So it's like being able to see somebody and see them as a valuable person that is put on this earth to make an impact
Yes.
is ultimately what we all are.
Right.
I'm no different.
Right. Right.
So it's like, it's important to be seen. It's important to be valued and find that sense of intrinsic value within us. And oftentimes a person who struggles with addiction for a long time, they lose that sense of self. They lose that sense of value. They lose that sense of purpose as a result of losing material things and relationships around them.
Yes.
That reflects that internal emptiness that they feel. And they feel like they have to fill it up with substances.
Right.
So bringing back and remembering that value within us, remembering that we're all brought here for a purpose and for a reason.
Now, how in your work, well, let's talk about that first. Now, why did you choose harm reduction?
Harm reduction chose me.
Okay,
I
well,
didn't
how did
choose
it
harm
choose you?
reduction.
Okay.
So I've always considered myself to be a feelings nurse.
Okay.
Because I started working in mental health. I fell in love with the field of mental health. One, because I'm a little bit cuckoo myself, right?
Well, they say we make the best, okay?
We make the best, right? So because I've had a significant amount of lived experience with trauma and mental health, I decided that I wanted to stay in the field of being able to talk about our feelings, right? And in that, I had a few transitions between inpatient, community health, and then ultimately when I moved to Brockton, I wanted to work at Brockton Neighborhood Health Center where we'd be able to give back to the same community that I came from.
Right, right.
So I applied for one job and they called me for another one. I said, okay, let's see how this goes.
So they called you for the harm reduction?
They called me for the harm reduction
Okay,
job.
all right.
And instantly when I walked in, I fell in love because it's the same thing of just ultimately treating everyone like they're decent human beings,
Right.
worthy and deserving of being seen, valued, and treated for their underlying condition.
Right.
And it made sense, but I had my own bias. I said, I don't know about this stuff. This seems a little sus to me. And I had to confront my own biases, and I had to allow myself to learn from my patients just the same way my children teach me a lot of things. So one of the biases that I had with harm reduction is I felt as if treating substance use with medication, it's as if changing one substance for another, and it's still not solving anything.
Right.
And I didn't understand how the pharmacological benefits of the Suboxone and the Sublocade and the Subutex and how all of these things worked to create what is considered a ceiling effect, so that you don't have that high feeling, but you're able to manage your addiction by avoiding cravings and withdrawals, which is ultimately where you want to be. Because a person who's experiencing opiate addiction or addicted to heroin, which doesn't exist in Brockton anymore, it's just fentanyl.
In Boston either, I understand it.
Yeah,
Right.
no, exactly. So a person who's experiencing this is that ultimately they're just trying to avoid that withdrawal feeling. They don't want to be sick. So they'll take just enough to feel okay and go about their day. And understanding how the medication works and seeing people in long-term recovery, 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years in recovery. They now have a home. They're managers at their job. They started a business. They're a CEO of their own company. They have their children. They have other children. They're living life. And they have long-term recovery as a result of being able to take something that helps to manage and sustain their recovery.
Now, let's take, I don't want to say take it to the extreme, but you would have some that would argue with that, because harm reduction also include safe using, if you will, providing needles and different things, even safe places to inject. Right. What would you say to that?
So again, it's like I had to confront and understand that there were certain perceptions or biases or feelings that I felt about that from the perspective of what I would, the way I saw it was almost like enabling, right? That's the word I would say. It's like, I don't enable my own kids. Why am I going to enable an adult? Like, this doesn't make sense, right? But I also had to understand and confront the reality that no one likes to be told what to do. And when you tell them to do this, they're going to do the opposite. And if they're not ready to commit to that level of change, how can you ultimately keep that person alive and be able to work towards positive change in a way that they're able to now, when they're ready, build up that self-confidence, build up that self-esteem, build up that self-worth, so that they're able to continue to move on the spectrum of recovery. And if we can prevent HIV along the way, if we can give a person who is selling their body anyways to get drugs, if we can give them some condoms to avoid some pregnancies here and there and things of that nature, then we're doing a service that is helping to alleviate suffering in the long haul. So the way I see harm reduction, it's like wearing a seatbelt. You can't tell somebody or force somebody not to drink and drive. You can't force somebody not to speed, but you can tell them to put on a seatbelt, and you're saving lives. Same thing with smoke detectors in your house. You wouldn't tell somebody, you can't smoke in your house. You can't force them to, right? You can tell them it's unsafe to smoke in the house. You can tell them don't smoke while you're in the bed sleeping, because you might fall asleep and start a fire. But since we can't control human behaviors, we can create safety nets in a form of a harm reduction. So that way, if something does happen that we would prefer not to happen, that we can avoid and keep you safe. So ultimately, it's about safety, it's about keeping people alive, and it's about rewarding positive change so that they can move closer and closer to the spectrum, of recovery to sustained recovery.
Okay. Now, the producers just came out, believe it or not. We have like 2 minutes and we need to wrap this up. So before I wrap it up, I would like for you to look and leave some parting words with our audience, please, and then I'll wrap it up. Okay.
All right. So some parting words that I have for this community is just a lot of gratitude for this opportunity, feeling honored to really be here with you guys and be able to shed light on the root cause of really the problem that then is masked by the crisis that we have with addictions, and ultimately understanding that by giving more empathy, by giving more grace, and by speaking and having these uncomfortable conversations from the perspective of acceptance, love, we can be able to help individuals live in liberation from that trauma, live in liberation from that addiction. And in the meantime, we can keep them safe, right? Whether that means we have Narcan in our homes so that if something does happen, in our homes or even in our purses while we're out, that we can be able to save a life, to give them an opportunity to be able to work on that recovery another day. Whether that means that we're able to look at somebody that otherwise would have been overlooked, whether that means that we're giving a compliment or showing somebody that they're valuable, even though deep down they might not feel that way. So I am grateful to be here, and I just really hope that this message ultimately leaves you with more thoughts around how can I be an advocate for someone who's suffering in silence? How can I support somebody who is feeling isolated or feeling not valuable at this time? And how can I support them in helping them move towards recovery, even if that means it's at a crawl or at a slow pace, because it's ultimately their pace.
Well, thank you. It was definitely an honor to have you as our guest. And I know there was so much more we could have talked about, so I would definitely like to extend an invitation for you to come back at a later date. Yes, thank you. Well, once again, this has been a great show, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And remember, we all have to do this collectively. One or two people can't do it. We have to come together to start the healing and the recovery process in our community. And in closing, I bid you peace, love, and blessings always. And remember, the best is yet to come. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.